Imagine being crammed into a freezing, pitch-black room with dozens of others, no food, no water, no hope, forced to live as a slave laborer with no hope of release. This was the reality for over 1 million victims of Auschwitz. Today, we will uncover the victims' stories of untold suffering and the brutal reality of the concentration camp system. Auschwitz. I still hear the sound of boots stomping and the endless crying of children. Auschwitz is not just a memory, it is my shadow. These words capture the essence of Auschwitz, the largest Nazi concentration camp, where over 1.1 million people, mostly Jews, were murdered during the Holocaust. Established in 1940 in Nazi-occupied Poland, Auschwitz became a symbol of modern, industrialized cruelty. Prisoners faced horrific conditions, overcrowded living conditions, rampant disease, starvation, brutal forced labor, and relentless, unrestrained violence. Many were subjected to inhumane medical experiments, while others were marched to the gas chambers or worked to death in toxic factories and workshops. Auschwitz was not just a concentration camp, it was an extermination camp, and none of its inmates were ever expected to survive. The Nazi regime's obsession with racial purity fueled its construction, as the Nazis sought to systematically eradicate Jews, who were believed to be racially and genetically inferior and the cause of all of Germany's problems. The camp was not dedicated only to the extermination of Jews. Any Untermensch, those considered racially impure or socially inferior, could find themselves victims of Auschwitz. Romani people, Poles, Soviet prisoners of war, and even common criminals were held at that camp. Auschwitz also served to support the German war effort, exploiting prisoners for forced labor in factories and mines, where they were subjected to toxic chemicals and back-breaking labor. This industrialized killing and enslavement reflected the Nazis' belief that certain lives were expendable and could be exploited to elevate the racially, socially, and even spiritually pure German Aryan race. Auschwitz operated as a complex system with separate subcamps and blocks, serving distinct, horrific purposes. Some areas were for forced labor, where prisoners toiled under brutal conditions, while others were for medical experiments, led by infamous figures like Joseph Mengele. The death blocks housed those awaiting execution, often in gas chambers, or were used as punishment sites with dedicated instruments of torture. Each block served a specific purpose in the Nazis' master plan for their worldwide Tausendjähriges Reich, the Thousand-Year Empire. Block 11. Auschwitz Block 11 was known as the Death Block. It was a site of unimaginable depravity. Inmates sent here faced brutal tortures, including starvation cells, where prisoners were left to die without food or water, and standing cells, where 4 people were crammed into a small space, unable to sit or lie down. Torture is usually used as a means to extract information, but in this case, it was usually nothing more than pure sadism, a recreational activity for the brutal camp guards. Survivors like Witold Pilecki, a Polish officer and resistance member who infiltrated Auschwitz to gather intelligence, endured unimaginable suffering here, witnessing countless deaths. Another survivor, Jerzy Bielecki, recalled the pervasive fear of Block 11, where interrogations often led to summary executions. The Sonderkommandos, camp prisoners acting as slave laborers, were forced to remove the bodies of their fallen campmates and to remove any hair or dental fillings from their corpses. Block 11 at Auschwitz holds a dark place in history as the site of the first experiments with Zyklon B for mass executions. On September 3, 1941, Nazi officials tested the pesticide gas on a group of 600 Soviet prisoners of war and 250 sick Polish inmates. This test was unsophisticated when compared to those that came later. The victims were herded into a small basement, which had been made airtight by piling earth around the windows, and the gas was pumped in. Most died within the first day, but a small number survived until September 5th. The experiment demonstrated the efficiency of Zyklon B as a method of mass murder, leading to its implementation in the camp's gas chambers. These first victims of Zyklon B were not just test subjects, but a horrifying prelude to the industrial-scale killings that would define the Holocaust. Block 11 at Auschwitz was notorious for its calculated and horrifying acts of torture. Prisoners accused of resistance or defiance were subjected to unimaginable cruelty. One infamous method involved hanging detainees by their arms, tied behind their backs for hours on end in a position that caused excruciating pain. In another instance, prisoners were confined in standing cells so small that 4 people would be packed into a space barely large enough to stand upright, often without food or water for days. Many died this way as they struggled to breathe in the confined environment. When a victim did die, there was not even enough room for their body to fall to the floor. Beatings with iron rods or whips were routine, and some inmates were forced to kneel on sharp-edged wooden blocks for hours. Guards also subjected prisoners to floggings and other punishments. These tortures often led to the victim being unable to work, which would result in their execution. Block 10. Auschwitz Block 10 was another site of unimaginable cruelty, specifically dedicated to cruel and unethical medical experiments. Inmates, often women, were subjected to grotesque, inhumane experiments under the guise of scientific research. These included forced sterilizations and the testing of new drugs, as well as causing wounds to observe how they healed. Many experiments were carried out in order to find ways to sterilize certain groups en masse, while others hoped to find new techniques and medications to treat various battlefield injuries and diseases. Victims were often left with lifelong physical and psychological scars, and many perished during or after these torturous procedures. The most notorious experiments were conducted on twins, with around 1,500 pairs of twins falling victim. Survivors like Eva Moses Kor, who was subjected to Mengelé's twin experiments, lived to tell the story of the relentless cruelty carried out in this block, where human lives were reduced to nothing more than scientific tools. Of the 1,500 sets of twins, only 200 were believed to have survived. Alongside Mengele, Block 10 at Auschwitz became infamous for the barbaric medical experiments conducted by Dr. Karl Klauberg, a Nazi physician who focused on methods of mass sterilization. Klauberg injected women with caustic solutions directly into their uteruses, causing intense pain, severe internal damage, and often permanent sterilization. Many women died from infections or the extreme trauma inflicted during the experiments, while the few survivors were left infertile. One survivor, who spent 11 months at Auschwitz, recalled, "I was used as a guinea pig for medical experiments. I was never ever given painkillers or anesthetics. Every day I suffered excruciating pain. I was injected with drugs and chemicals. My body most of the time was connected to tubes which inserted some drugs into my body. Many days I was tied up for hours. Some days they made cuts into my body and left the wounds open for them to study. Most of the time there was nothing to eat. Every day my body was numb with pain. There was no more skin left on my body for them to put injections or tubes." Klauberg's cruel experiments were part of the Nazis' attempts to eradicate entire populations through modern industrial means. Dr. August Hirt, a Nazi physician and anthropologist, was another notorious Nazi scientist infamous for his obsession with collecting Jewish skeletons. In 1943, Hirt selected a group of 86 inmates to become part of his collection. They were sent to Natzweiler-Struhof concentration camp, where they were executed. Their skulls were removed and sent to Hirt's laboratory at the University of Strasbourg. There was no end to the depravity of Block 10, with one survivor recounting, "The SS officer, who was probably a doctor, dressed in white robes, shoved an iron stick, which had a handle on its end, right into my rectum. He then turned the stick and caused an involuntary ejaculation of sperm. A female SS officer who worked with the other officer held 2 pieces of glass underneath my genitals in order to collect a sample of my sperm for the lab." The Death Wall. The Death Wall stood between Block 10 and Block 11. Here, thousands of prisoners, including Jews, political prisoners, and resistance fighters, were executed. The executions were often carried out by firing squad, with victims stripped naked before being shot in the back of the head. This site of mass murder was not only a place of death, but also a tool of terror used to instill fear among the prisoners to prevent resistance or disobedience. The executions were quick and brutal, but the psychological torment endured by those waiting to be killed was far more lasting. The first executions at the death wall took place on November 11, 1941, Polish National Independence Day, when 151 Polish prisoners were shot in a mass execution. These prisoners, many of them intellectuals, activists, and members of the Polish resistance, were selected as part of the Nazis' effort to crush Polish identity and resistance, as part of their arm of Germanizing their occupied territories. Forced to kneel before a firing squad, they were murdered in cold blood, marking the beginning of the death wall's horrific legacy. The wall was dismantled in 1944, but the deaths continued. Buna Werke. Auschwitz III, also known as Monowitz, was established as a forced labor camp. The camp housed thousands of prisoners who were forced into grueling labor at the Buna Werke plant, which produced synthetic rubber for the Nazi war effort. While the forced laborers were provided with more food, the hard labor took a toll on their bodies, and thousands died while working or in the camp's hospital. The laborers were subjected to brutal treatment by the guards, and many succumbing to exhaustion, disease, or fatal accidents in the factory. There was no effort to prevent these deaths, as any worker could be quickly replaced with a new inmate. Those who could no longer work were of no more use and were often sent to the gas chambers at Auschwitz I. The inmates at camp were rented to private German businesses for a small fee paid to the German government. IG Farben, Siemens, and American-owned IBM are only some of the companies that profited from the cheap slave labor provided by Auschwitz. Men and women worked long 11-hour days without a break, with one survivor saying, "We couldn't speak much. If we spoke and the guards saw us, we got beaten up. We only were allowed to work." The workers owned nothing more than a bowl for soup and the clothes on their back, and were forced to use discarded cement bags as toilet paper and bandages. Unfinished justice. Auschwitz stands as one of history's darkest chapters, a place where inhumanity reached unimaginable levels. Within its confines, individuals were stripped of their dignity, identity, and ultimately, for most, their lives. The camp's systematic brutality, from forced labor to medical experiments and mass executions, was designed to break the human spirit and eradicate supposedly inferior races, all while exploiting them to help fuel the German war machine. Starvation, violence, and constant fear were daily realities, and over 1 million people would never leave Auschwitz. The cruelty inflicted here was not random, but calculated, a carefully constructed system of oppression that reflected the depths of the Nazi regime's hatred and disregard for those human lives that it considered beneath it. For those who survived, the trauma of Auschwitz was a lifelong burden. Survivors faced immense challenges in rebuilding their lives, haunted by memories of the horrors they endured and the loved ones they lost. Justice for these crimes was partial at best. While key figures like Rudolf Höss was tried and executed, many perpetrators escaped accountability. The Nuremberg trials and later prosecutions condemned hundreds, but countless others evaded justice. While many perpetrators have been identified and tried in the 80 years since the war, how many totally evaded justice is not and will never be known.